Shadows over Innistrad Remastered is coming to Arena, and there are some huge important things to talk about. There are downshifted cards that are now budget options, even though they used to be rares. There's a lot of wonderful cards that are going to make different archetypes possible. There are some that are going to improve different archetypes, and I just wanted to talk about some of the most important cards from the set from my perspective. Starting with, if you are a fan of Artisan, you know what's first, and that is the untapped lands. These are the only dual lands, besides like secluded courtyards, super specific types of ones. These are the only dual lands that produce two specific colors that have potential to come into play untapped at uncommon or common rarity. These are huge. A lot of people are talking about them making 3-color decks work, and I think that's to some degree true. But in a 3-color deck, to get these to come into play untapped, you need to be running other bad dual lands. And so I'm not sure that this makes 3-color decks that much better. It'll make them good, but I think it will make 2-color decks even more better than it will make 3-color decks better, if that makes sense. Next, we've got Madness Burn. Madness Burn is something that Morbid Mind in the Artisan Discord has been talking about a lot, and we got some good cards for it. We've got Alms of the Vein, which is a 1 mana, drain your opponent for 3, which in a burn deck, the life gain is actually significant, because a lot of times you're actually just racing your opponent, because they can't interact with you slowly killing them, so their only option is to race you. So gaining 3 life and dealing 3 is incredible. Bump in the Night, one of the most efficient possible burn spells. Also, if you flood out, I guess it has flashback, but just as a 3 life drain for 1 mana, it's great. And lastly, Brimstone Volley, which can deal 5 damage to a player for 3 mana, but only if a creature died this turn. I'm not sure if this is going to see any play, but if you flood out Searing Blood into Brimstone Volley, seems like a lot of damage. It seems like a cool play. We'll see if that one sees any play. Next, we've got more Madness. So these could see play in Madness Burn or Madness Aggro, but I'm actually wondering if there's a good Madness mid-range deck. So we've got Blood Mad Vampire, very aggressive, starts growing. You can get it down on turn 2 as a 4/1. That's super strong. Stormkirk Occultist is also a fairly aggressive creature for 2 mana, but it has the benefit of drawing you more cards, which feels a bit more in the mid-range for me. Alchemist Greeting only kills creatures, so once again, a bit more of a mid-range thing to me. Gisa's Bidding is a bit expensive. It makes 2/2/2 zombies, which is pretty decent for 3 mana. Biting Rain is definitely not likely to go in your Madness Burn aggro deck. Actually, I could see it seeing some play, but you'd be killing your own Kitchen Imps, you'd be killing some of your own cards, and it might not be that good there. But once again, I could see a Madness aggro deck formulating around these. And if you're not that familiar with Madness, one super important thing about it is it doesn't care whether your cards are sorceries or creatures. If you discard on your opponent's, like your opponent swings out with all their creatures, or they play a bunch of creatures at their end of their turn. End of turn, you discard Biting Rain, you cast it for its Madness, even though it's sorceries. Even though it's a sorcery. You can Madness these in at instant speed. So that leads to some really awesome things, where these 2/2/2 black zombies for 3, like, that's a decent card. But when they're flash 2/2 zombies, that's really powerful. So as far as how we're going to enable this, Faithless Looting, probably the most important card from the entire set. It is now a common, or I'm not sure that it's a common, but it's most likely going to be a common now. Draw 2, discard 2, and it has flashback. This just enables so much. If you've got graveyard-based shenanigans, if you've got recursion, if you've got madness, any sort of thing that gets you benefit from discarding or having things in your graveyard, it's a weird cantrip that digs deep and doesn't actually lose you on card advantage because those resources in your graveyard are resources. Haunted Dead looks pretty bad, but it's actually good. If you can discard this, and then eventually you can pay 2 and discard 2 more cards to get it to the battlefield, it sounds bad, but you get 2 bodies from the 2 cards you discarded, and once again, if you have these shenanigans where you get value off of discarding things, this is a very powerful creature. It sits in your graveyard, and it itself is a resource in your graveyard. So you can discard 2 Haunted Deads to Haunted Dead and then discard more cards to those, and like you just get a bunch of value. This fits very well in some sort of madness deck. I'm not sure if it'll be the best option, but it's definitely something worth looking at. And we've also got Advanced Stitchwing, very similar, bigger body, and bigger cost, which makes it a little bit weaker, I think. Also, it's blue, and maybe there's a Madness control deck, but I'm not too excited about the blue Madness spells. Lastly, Call the Bloodline. This is nice simply because it's 1 mana, trigger your Madness. And it makes a 1/1 Vampire Knight with lifelink. That's not bad at all. This seems like a really good enabler in some sort of grindy, dirtily deck that's... You could do it with stuff like drawing lands, like cards that tutor a bunch of lands to hand, because those are a bit cheaper than just drawing cards. You can start discarding lands to it. You can do madness stuff with it. You can run this in Reanimator, and the 1/1 lifelink will help stall the game until you start reanimating big things. Lots of good applications of this. I'm not sure if it's the best option, but I can see it seeing play. And now let's talk about the tribes. There are a lot of tribes that are getting support in this, and the one that is getting the most support is vampires. Rakdos vampires specifically, and specifically all of these cards are good for aggro vampires. So I've played aggro vampires before with like Vampiric Interloper, and it is surprisingly good, playing just a 2/1 flying that can't block, and then Gift of Fangs to turn it into a 4/3, and then I play whatever Vampire Lord there is that gives them all +1/+1 counters, etc. And these cards are just going to straight up upgrade it. We've got Stromkirk Captain, which will give everything +1/+1 in first strike. So a Lord is always good for an aggro deck, and first strike makes blocking a nightmare for your opponent. It's so much harder to block against first strike. Indulgent Aristocrat is one of the best 1-drops we've got. It's a little bit of flat-out protection, and the sacrificing a creature at instant speed to put a +1/+1 counter on every vampire you control is going to do work. That is just the threat of activation, once again, makes blocking a nightmare. And when blocking's a nightmare, sometimes your opponent opts not to block, which is good when you're an aggro deck. Olivia's Bloodsworn, strict upgrade over the Vampiric Interloper, or whatever it's called, the 2/1 flying that can't block. This one can also give haste to other things, which I guess is fine. Stenzia Masquerade, you'd have to go into a Madness Vampires build. Just kind of be a... I mean, that's a theme of vampires, Madness Vampires. I'm not sure if this is good enough because Vampire Aggro probably doesn't have space for these sorts of effects. But if you do have a discard sub-theme in your Vampire deck, this is a really powerful card, giving everything first strike. Once again, that's terrible, and you can flash this in if you do Madness, so that's really scary. And putting a +1/+1 counter on each vampire is pretty good. I guess you don't need Madness for this. I hadn't really thought of that, but ignore the Madness on this, and it's actually kind of a good card. So maybe that's where this sees plays, just in generic vampires that can't even trigger the Madness. And lastly, Vampiric Fury. Once again, first strike, awful to deal with, and vampire creatures you control get +2 power until end of turn. If you're swinging in with 3 vampires, let's say, and your opponent doesn't block, you have 3 unblocked vampires. This is 2 mana, burn for 6 damage. If your opponent's blocking, you're probably going to be doing something that they thought they were killing your creature, you're turning it into you killing their creature. This is an incredible card, and it's a common, so Pauper fans, I actually think you should try building a deck around it. I tried building a deck around Oketra's Monument Zombie, not Oketra's Monument, Oketra, In the Name of Oketra Zombies, and it felt kind of bad, but when I drew in Oketra's name, that's what it's called, in Oketra's name, when I drew it, it was super good. This is a very similar effect, I think, some sort of go wide. Just play all your cheap vampires, swing out Vampiric Fury, could actually be good. Second tribe to talk about, werewolves. So werewolves, these are the cards I think are good for werewolves. Halpak Resurgence, I didn't like very much until I realized Trample. Currently in Artisan, there's a big problem of token blockers. People will just spam 1/1 tokens and stick them in front of your big creatures. The fact that you can give everything Trample makes this card actually really good. So I'm not certain on it, but I think the fact this has Trample makes it potentially viable. Moon Mist, I'm also not as sure on. transform all humans is good. That is super good. That's really the reason that I want this card. I'm preventing combat damage, whatever, but just surprise, all of my creatures are now more powerful than you thought. This is a team pump spell, probably gives +1/+1 to all of your creatures. It triggers extra effects. It's just going to throw your opponent off a ton to have Moon Mist down. Immerwolf keeps your wolves, prevents them from transforming, which I guess is good. I actually think that could be more valuable than I'm not sure how much to measure that. The fact that it keeps your werewolves as werewolves. They never transform back. I don't know how valuable that is. But a werewolf lord that also has Intimidate seems pretty solid in an aggro deck. Once again, I think this is an aggro build. We've also got Gaia Reach Bandit. Used to be a rare. This has been downshifted to uncommon. It's just a haste 3/2 that flips, and when it flips, it lets you flip all your other werewolves that you play after it. It's kind of confusing having both different types of werewolves. It will be a messy deck to keep track of, and it will have weird lines, especially if you're running Moon Mist and Immerwolf and Gaia Reach Bandit and wolves from both sets. It'll be wacky. But this is a solid creature, just 3 damage on turn 3. That's a powerful part of an aggro deck. And actually the 2 wolves that I'm most excited about, and this seems weird, but these are the 2 wolves I'm most excited about because werewolf decks did not have good 1-drops. We had like some vanilla 1/1 that you could pump it to 3/3 for 2 mana, which is like okay. But these cards, Young Wolf is hard to kill, and it comes back stronger. Village Messenger has haste and can become a 2/2 menace. Those are both fantastic 1-drops, and why a 1-drop is so essential to a werewolf deck is Pack Song Pup. Pack Song Pup is a 2-drop that says at the beginning of combat on your turn, this gets +1/+1 counter on it if you control a wolf or werewolf. Adding these to your deck, 4 copies of each, means that you are very likely to start off your game going Village Messenger, swing in for 1. Turn 2, Pack Song Pup, and now you've got something that is growing every turn. It'll feel not quite as bad, but it'll feel similar to a Luminarch Aspirant on your opponent's side of the battlefield, where they're just going to start growing something and you have to answer it fast. So I'm very excited to have 1-drop wolves in this deck. And there's one more wolf to talk about, but I'm not sure that it really fits the wolf tribal theme, and that's Duskwatch Recruiter. Duskwatch Recruiter is... It's a werewolf, and the backside of it, I forgot to put a picture up here. It's a 3/3 with creature spells cost 1 less to cast, but it is also a mana sink. So you look at the top 3 cards of your library, put a creature card into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library. It's actually a pretty good ability if you're a creature-heavy deck. This can be a mana sink to keep your game plan going, but it's a little bit awkward, the fact that one side of this card is a card that finds more creatures, and then the other side of it is one that ramps you, and you kind of actually don't want both of those in one deck. But the more I think about it, the more I like this card in Werewolves, because that's an activated ability. And the power of activated abilities in Werewolves is you can spend your mana digging for more creatures on a turn and still have it flip to nighttime. So Duskwatch Recruiter is great simply because you can take a turn off without completely taking the turn off, which is something that Werewolves very often wants to do. It's like Duskwatch Recruiter into Immerwolf, and then you spend the next turn just looking with Duskwatch Recruiter, and you drew a creature for 3 mana. Not that great of an activated ability, but you also do at least something while you're letting your wolves flip. So I like this card a lot in Werewolves. I think I like it more in just random stuff. It's an infinite mana sink. If you have infinite mana, you can usually win the game if you have this on the battlefield. There's a few cool things you can do with it. Reducing the cost of creatures. I'm sure someone is going to try and make this work with Grinning Ignis. That someone might be me, but let's move on past Werewolves to spirits. I don't have a good picture of Skull Captain, but other spirits you control get +1/+1 and have hexproof, and it has flying itself. Skull Captain, amazing, super duper good lord. Your opponent has to answer it before they answer anything else, and if you get 2 of them on the battlefield, they protect each other. If you have 2 Skull Captains on the battlefield, just trying to imagine what this is like. They're 3/3s, which means they dodge most of the cheap wraths, stuff like Crush the Weak. They dodge Fast and Furious because they're flying. They dodge any sort of targeted removal. You're really only going to get rid of these with an Edict or casting multiple Wraths. This just makes your Spirits board super hard to kill. Nebelgast Herald is amazing simply because it has Flash. Flash is useful in a Spirit deck because Spirits are disruptive. You want to have your mana up for a counterspell, and then your opponent doesn't do anything that you want to counter, and so instead you play Nebelgast Herald. The fact that you can play a creature, you can add aggression to the battlefield without having to commit to it on your turn. You can wait and see what your opponent does and then decide, am I going to disrupt my opponent or am I going to just increase my game plan? Nebelgast Herald is perfect for that sort of game plan. Lastly, we've got, oh no, not lastly, there's actually one more tribe after this, but we've got the Zombie Lord Diregraph Captain with Death Touch, gives your zombies +1/+1, and I really like this last ability. Whenever a zombie dies, each opponent loses 1 life. One problem with aggro decks is sometimes your opponent just stabilizes and you can't really get through blockers or whatever. This makes it so that you can swing through blockers, you kill them. Like, this gives you a lot of reach in the end game. If you've got a big board and your opponent's like stabilized it simply by having, Jewel Thieves or whatever, this card is going to make blocking worse for your opponent. You can swing into them, chump attack, and it's fine. So maybe there's a zombie deck out there. I'm not too convinced that zombies will have a valid Artisan deck. There's just too many other good things to be doing, but this card might make it happen. Hamlet Captain. I think this is also a downshift card. I don't remember. Whenever you attack or block, other humans you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Effectively a lord for humans. I really like Hamlet Captain, simply because if you're in a green-white deck that's got some sort of aggressive game plan, there's a high chance that you just randomly have humans. You randomly have a lot of humans. Humans is the most common tribe in Magic, I believe. And so if you have this, you might be building an aggressive deck and realize, I have a bunch of humans and I'm in green. Just throw this card in. You don't need to be a human tribal card to likely have this card be good for you. Human tribal doesn't seem that great in general, but this might see play in decks that aren't heavily themed around humans. Next, the card, probably my most controversial take. I think Delirium is good. We've got cards like Circuit Mender. So, to clarify, Delirium is only good in a mid-range deck. And the reason why is it takes too much time to fill your graveyard. And if you're filling your graveyard quickly, like, if you're trying to fill your graveyard to get Delirium online, you can't be an aggro deck. Like, you can't take off turns 1 through 3 or whatever, trying to get everything in your graveyard and then go for it. Sure, Dragon's Rage Channeler might pull that off, but that's an exception. That card's just busted. So these cards are the ones that I think are the reason to play Delirium. Deathcap Cultivator gets Death Touch with Delirium, but it's good early as ramp. Gnarlwood Dryad stalls your opponent out with Death Touch, which is great for a mid-range deck, but then becomes a 3/3 body later and dodges Wrath, which is also great for mid-range. So both of these cards I like in a mid-range deck. Having a death-touching blocker can be really annoying, and both of these cards are that to some degree. Having ramp is good, and having 3/3 creatures that dodge cheap wrath is also good. So I could see some sort of Delirium deck going on. You wouldn't want to rely on your graveyard too much with the Delirium deck. You'd want to just be kind of a good mid-range deck that happens to turn on Delirium, but I think it's worth playing a couple weird enchantments or artifacts to make it happen. And I think it's very possible in mid-range because of cards like Spirited Companion and Circuit Mender, which I know is a card that some people in the Artisan Discord love. Artifact creature that you want to just chump block with, that gives you 2 types in the graveyard already. You have a lot of good sacrifice lands, like sacrifice-based lands are good. I can see, what's the card? Eccentric Farmer is a fairly good mid-range card just to keep your ramp going. But the card that I think makes it worth going for Delirium 100% is Obsessive Skinner, which I honestly would compare to Luminarch Aspirant. This is It puts a +1/+1 counter on the turn you play it, and then on every single one of your opponent's turns, which effectively is keeping up with the same clock that Luminarch Aspirant would. So if you've got Delirium, and you guys know how awful it is to play against Aspirant, like that card sees play back to Vintage, back to Legacy. This card is similar if you have Delirium on, so that is a good card. I think this is the card that will make Delirium work if Delirium ever becomes a deck. There's a couple other Delirium cards. Invasive Surgery, I don't think this is actually that good of a card. Counter target sorcery spell gets outclassed by Miscast most of the time. There's not really that many important sorceries to be countering. I could see this being a sideboard card against like Is It Fling deck, like a Serpentine Curve, Experimental Overload. I can't remember what the other ones are called. Seize the Storm. If you're trying to beat that kind of deck, this could be good. But otherwise, it's outclassed by Miscast, and it's probably still outclassed by Test of Talents if you're trying to play it in a slower matchup. So I'm not sure it'll see play. Pick the Brain, I really want to work, but I don't think it will. Opponent reveals their hand, you exile a card from it, and then you exile it from their graveyard everywhere. You exile the rest of the copies from their deck. And the issue is you can't get Delirium and 3 mana and hit your opponent with this fast enough. In a lot of matchups, I'm thinking specifically of Anvil. I would love to remove Anvil from my opponent's hand and deck and graveyard. So good. Except if it's in their hand, they're probably already casting it by the time I'm casting Pick the Brain. It's very unlikely that I have Delirium and I'm able to cast Pick the Brain while they have Anvil in their hand. They're going to, every time they draw it, they'll immediately cast it. So you're never going to catch it. So I'm not sure, and just the same thing applies to a lot of other decks. I'm not sure that this card's going to see play. As far as enabling Delirium goes, Grapple with the Past is a pretty good card to look at. Not as good as Grizzly Salvage, in my opinion. Grizzly Salvage is incredible, but this card can do some good stuff. Especially if you're like a combo deck that uses the graveyard and needs a specific card back, like you play the card, it dies, you want to regain it from the graveyard. Grapple with the Past can be good there. Vessel of Nascency is very quick for turning on Delirium. You're going to be milling 4 cards, well, I guess milling 3 cards from your deck, and putting an enchantment in the graveyard. Enchantment is one of the hardest cards to get into your graveyard, and this card does it for you. So, probably a slam dunk in a Delirium deck. Next, we've got some cards that care about instants and sorceries in the graveyard. Forbidden Alchemy lets you mill some. It's pretty much a strategic planning that's more expensive, but also better because it has flashback and sees 4 cards. I don't think this will see play. Pieces of the Puzzle is more likely to me. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You get 2 instant and sorceries from them, and the rest go into your graveyard. This feels like it could do something. I could see this in the Is It Fling decks, the Seize the Storm, all those Experimental Overloads, Serpentine Curve decks. I can see this seeing play there. Maybe it sees play in control decks as well if they use their graveyard well. I don't know. Rise from the Tides, I want it to work, but there's just better cards. 6 mana to build a bunch of zombies, weak to graveyard hate, and weak to wraths. I just don't think this card can work, and it's really sad to me. If you already have this kind of mana, I'd rather just have a Fling effect and Serpentine Curve. It also plays around removal and edicts. This doesn't really play around anything that you can't play around in other ways in these decks. And it's just so expensive and so easy to beat. Moving on. Clues. Once again, I don't think clues are going to work. So we've got one payoff that I think is worth it. Ulvenwald Mysteries. Non-token creature dies, you investigate. If you sacrifice a clue, create a 1/1 human soldier creature token. Making a soldier creature token whenever you sacrifice a clue is great, especially considering you don't have to sacrifice it to its ability. You could be doing Deadly Dispute on it, although we're probably going to be a blue-green deck. But if you have other ways to sacrifice your clues, this goes up even more in value. You can be sacrificing your creatures and then sacrificing your clues. I could see a Golgari deck built around Ulvenwald Mysteries to some degree, where you're just sacrificing your creatures, deadly disputing your clues. That gives you more sacrifice fodder. That seems like a good loop. But as far as a clue-based deck goes, there's just not really good payoffs. Confront the Unknown, give your creature +4/+4, maybe. Like, it's just, it investigates, so this card kind of replaces itself, but it's not great. Graph Mole, you sacrifice a clue to gain 3 life. It's an okay statted creature, but it's just not enough life gain. I feel like I'm not sure that's going to do much. Erdwall Illuminator, double investigate, but how many investigate effects are you going to have in your deck? If you're already playing this and this, once you add, as you try to force more and more good investigate cards into your deck becomes you're playing bad cards to make bad cards good. And when you're doing that, you end up with a couple of good cards and a lot of bad cards. I'd rather just play a deck full of good cards. Daring Sleuth also is one of the other ones I'd consider maybe be good, but the thing is, you need to sacrifice a clue to transform it, and then it becomes a 3/2 prowess that investigates when you hit your opponent. I don't think this is good because 3/2 prowess for 2 sounds amazing, but you're not going to be sacrificing a clue until like turn 4. It's going to take a while to get this down and then sacrifice a clue. And so even though it's a 2-drop, I think it feels, as far as speed goes, more like a 4-drop. And that's just a 4-drop 3/2 prowess. So yeah, I'm not high on clues, but I am high on Ulvenwald Mysteries. I think this card has potential in some crazy shells. I really want to see it with Glimmerbairn, a card that cares about tokens. You can sacrifice a token to give it +2/+2, and it's just a 1-drop. So you could have Ulvenwald Mysteries, Erdwall Illuminator, and you could do some very crazy shenanigans with pumping up Glimmerbairn. But that's probably the most niche use I can think of that maybe clues could work in. If you're a fan of Boggles, we got a hexproof creature. We don't have very many hexproof creatures on Arena. Very few, especially very few this cheap. 2 mana, can't be blocked, hexproof. And we also got Grifspoon. I don't remember if this is already on Arena. If it's not, this is a great enchantment for your Boggles decks. But Invisible Stalker really makes me want to try blue in my Boggles decks. You've got Curiosity sort of effects. It could fit into quite a few things. It could be a sideboard card against, maybe it could be a sideboard card against Control as a 20-turn clock. Probably not. They're probably playing sweepers, but yeah, Boggles, I can see both of these cards making some waves, although blue is not the best Boggles color. Green and white really are. We've got some shenanigans. Essence Flux, Fiend Hunter. So Fiend Hunter looks like a lot of other cards. Enters the battlefield, you exile something. When it leaves the battlefield, you return it to the owner's control. But because of the way the stack works, you play Fiend Hunter, and then in response to exile target creature, you Essence Flux it. Fiend Hunter leaves the battlefield, and a trigger goes on the stack for return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. It resolves. There's no creature that Fiend Hunter has exiled, so nothing happens. And then it enters the battlefield, and you choose something to exile, and then the first exile target creature resolves, and you get to exile a creature, and it will never come back, because it already used the trigger to return it to the battlefield before it removed it from the battlefield. So Fiend Hunter is actually really good. I can see it in Soul Herder Blink decks. As a sideboard card, I can see it in the main deck. You play it, you Cloud Shift it right when it comes down, you Essence Flux it right when it comes down, and it exiles something permanently. And then it exiles something else temporarily. So you're getting rid of 2 things for 2 cards, one of them temporarily, one of them permanently. Very good. Some people want Emerge to work. I don't think Emerge works. I was looking at these, and if you want Emerge to work, you really want creatures that cheat on mana. So you could be playing some sort of domain deck with the green creature, or like a Power Matters deck with the red creature, or Tolarian Terror. That's the one that I know the name of. A Tolarian Terror deck. And then you can have a super cheap Emerge. But then I was looking at it, and I'm like, which would I rather have? This Eldrazi Crab that's a 5/7 and gets hexproof for a half a turn? Or would I rather have Tolarian Terror, which is a 5/5 with Ward 2? And as I think about it, I'd rather have Tolarian Terror. So why would I sacrifice my Tolarian Terror to get a worse creature? And so that's my thought process on these sorts of cards. I was looking through the Emerge cards, and none of them are good. None of them are good budget cards. So I'm scratching Emerge off the list. Graveyard cards. We've got some really good graveyard cards. Dauntless Cathar and Nearheath Chaplain are kind of okay. They're just mediocre creatures on their own. But if you're playing a deck that's discarding, if for some reason you're playing mono white madness, that's not a thing. But if you've got white cards in your graveyard, these are great because they're a mana sink. They're a resource in your graveyard. So if you're doing graveyard shenanigans, if you're milling stuff, if you're a sacrifice deck that likes these 1/1 white spirits, there's a couple different ways that I can see this being a valuable asset for your deck. Probably more powerful is Graph Harvest. If you're not using your graveyard, this does not need to be in a zombie deck. It has a zombie tribal effect. Zombies you control have menace, which I guess is good. And this probably does fit in a zombie deck. But paying 4 mana to get a zombie is actually really a good rate, because if you're filling your graveyard just naturally through combat and whatever, that's going to be a lot of zombies that you get, and 4 mana for a zombie that doesn't cost you a card, like you're not losing card advantage besides playing Graph Harvest in the first place. So I could see this being part of a dirtily deck. I'm specifically thinking of like the Phyrexian Reclamation type decks that are an Artisan. I could see this maybe being in that deck as a one of. Lingering Souls, incredible card. 2 1/1 flyers for 2 mana if you discard this. I could see you playing this in a deck that is not playing white. If you have discard effects, this is a great card. There's a famous old modern deck, Mardu Pyromancer, where you're playing Young Pyromancer into Lingering Souls, into Flashback Lingering Souls, into Faithless Looting. And so like the fact that this is 2 spells, it creates a lot of tokens. They're really good like chump blockers. They can block flyers. This is card advantage from your graveyard. Lingering Souls is a great card, and I expect it to see play. I'm not sure where, but it will see play. I'm almost certain. Not lastly, but we've got some more removal. Anguished Unmaking, downshifted to uncommon. Exile target non-land permanent. You lose 3 life. Plain and simple. 2 sentences. Period. Great card. Blessed Alliance. I'm not sure how great this one is, but target opponent sacrifices an attacking creature in white. If Bogles ever becomes a problem, this is a card to look out for, forcing your opponent to sacrifice. It's potentially decent against aggro. You can do some blowouts with untapping blockers. You can gain life. You can make them sacrifice an attacker. Although, perhaps in a lot of cases, it's just better to play the... Oh, what is it? It's a 2 mana cleave spell that's destroy target attacking creature. That might be just better than this, but this could see play if sacrifice as opposed to destroy is significant. And then Tragic Slip. Tragic Slip may replace Fatal Push. It may replace Fatal Push. If you're a sacrifice deck, giving something -13/-13, that's pretty bonkers. Gets around indestructible, gets around your opponent's creatures being whatever mana value. This kills pretty much everything if you have Morbid on. So if you have Morbid, it's easy to turn on. Or if you're playing kind of a controlling sacrifice deck, you might want Tragic Slip and Fatal Push. This can be a side grade of Fatal Push. I'm excited to hopefully see this see play. There's some more aggro-based removal that I could see seeing play. Magmatic Chasm, here on the right, is actually decent. Creatures without flying can't block this turn. If you're playing some sort of mono-red aggro or whatever, or maybe not mono-red, probably Gruul aggro, and you're a deck that generates board stalls, both players don't want to attack because there's no profitable attacks for both players. If you're in a board stall sort of situation, Magmatic Chasm could be good. Now, is there a deck that generates board stalls very easily? I don't think so, so I'm not sure this is going to see play. But if there ever was one, this card actually interests me as maybe playable. Ride Down. This is pretty good. This is literally destroy target blocking creature, and it's as though it didn't block. I hate cards that are destroy target blocking creature in aggro, simply because you waste so much damage. They choose to block your big attacker, and then you're like, and then I kill your creature, and then you still don't deal the damage, and it feels like they still came out ahead even though you killed their creature. This is much better as far as tempo goes, to give your creature trample that was blocked by it. So, Ride Down, I think could see play in Boros aggro, if there's a Boros aggro deck that keeps getting stomped by people playing big blockers. Um, and now let's talk about some individual cards. There is only one meld pair in Artisan that's like a budget option. Midnight Scavenger. Alright, so first of all, Graph Rats. 2-1 for 2 mana. Not very good. Midnight Scavengers. Not very good. It's a 3-3 for 5 mana that returns a creature mana value 3 or less to your hand. Like, I'm comparing this to Hero of the Dunes, and this just sucks. But the nice thing is, Midnight Scavengers can pull Graph Rats out of your graveyard, then you play it, and then you get this Chittering Host, which is a 5/6 menace haste that gives everything else +1 and menace. So I don't know what deck would use this. I'm thinking some sort of Go Wide Sacrifice, because that's just my instant thought whenever I see black combos, and because black sacrifice is the best way to dig through your deck for combos. But I'm just not sure if this is going to see play, but I'm sure someone will make it work. It's funny. You got to go for it. Someone will have fun with this deck. Curious Homunculus. Oh, I didn't put the backside of this card either. But spend this mana to do it's a mana dork for instants and sorceries. And it flips over into a card that says instant and sorceries cost 1 less. I'm not sure this is a good card. We've got Stormkiln Artist. We've got Goblin and Narcomancer. I think, do we have the good one? The Is It Goblin that's a 2/2 and makes instants and sorceries cost 1 less? Anyways, Storm, we've already got the tools for Storm, and Gruul actually looks like the better Storm color. This is just so fragile. It needs to survive an entire turn, so you can't just play it and combo off immediately. I just don't think this will see play. It's a cool card, but I'm marking this one off. Lupine Prototype. This was one of my first cards that I ever got excited about in Magic that really got me into brewing, so I'm hyped about this card, but I don't think it's good. If you're playing some sort of artifact aggro, or just an aggro deck in general that's dumping your hand onto the battlefield, or maybe you're even just playing a discard deck, which is really a bad idea. Discard decks suck. But this card might make discard decks okay. A 2 mana 5/5 is strong. If you're playing something where you are just dumping your hand, like mono 1-drop red aggro, this card could see play. This could be a 5/5 in your aggro deck that you just constantly are dumping your hand and getting this card down. I would be happy to see it see play, but it only fits in super specific decks, and it's not really worth building around, because an artifact creature that's 2 mana dies to too much. So if you build your whole deck around it, you're gonna just get blown out by removal. But if you don't build your whole deck around it and it fits, sure, go for it. This is a good card. Lone Rider. I love life gain payoffs that are not put a +1/+1 counter on this thing. This card is awesome. First Strike Lifelink is significant because it triggers other life gain things. So like if you have Trelisara and your opponent has a 3/3 blocker, and you swing with Lone Rider and Trelisara, your opponent blocks Trelisara with the 3/3. Then this does First Strike Lifelink, which puts a counter onto Trelisara before combat damage is dealt to Trelisara. Super solid in that regard. As well, if you're just incidentally gaining a lot of life in some random deck, and you can flip this over, a 2 mana 4/4 First Strike Trample Lifelink is going to win you the game. Not always, but this is dominant in combat. This just swings races. It shuts down aggro between First Strike and Lifelink. Just 4 toughness makes it really hard for red to remove. This is a solid card on the backside if you can flip it. So I could see this seeing play in decks that I'm trying to gain 1 life over and over and over again. Maybe a deck more focused on being just a mid-range deck that has life gain in it. I could see this seeing play. Avacyn's Pilgrim, not much to say here, but it is another 1 mana dork that filters your green mana into white mana in a weird way, which means that green-white ramp, if that's ever important, has a new tool to have more consistent starts. They can keep hands with just a forest and Avacyn's Pilgrim because they can get their white mana anyways. Although that's risky, but this might be significant. Gnaw to the Bone. I'm not sure if this will see play, but it is funny. The decks that are going to have a ton of creature cards in their graveyard are probably going to be graveyard decks, which means your opponent is going to have graveyard hate, which means this card is going to be bad. But if your opponent only has like targeted graveyard hate and you're like Reanimator, this card could be good. You gain 2 life for every creature card in your graveyard, and it has flashback for 3, which means if you mill this over, if you discard this, you can spend 3 mana to get a bunch of life. My issue, once again, is the fact that the decks that want this are going to want it in their sideboard, and in the post-sideboard games, your opponent's going to be running graveyard hate, so I'm not sure it's that useful. But we'll see. It could be useful just for like Phyrexian Reclamation, just to shore up against aggro if that's ever a problem. Brain in the Jar. I haven't looked too deep into this. I don't think this card is going to do anything. It's a cute card. There are some funny shenanigans with it, but it doesn't do much. And so I'm going to write this one off as a bad card. Terrarion, this is the last one. I really am just going through all the cards that I thought were significant at all. Terrarion is nice because it is an Explorer legal version of Chromatic Star. It is a card you can play and sacrifice to Anvil and draw a card. We already have Implement of Combustion. Implement of Combustion is nice because it pings your opponent for 1, but this is mana neutral when you sacrifice it, and the mana fixing in a 2-color deck could be significant. So Terrarion might be an upgrade over Implement of Combustion in Anvil decks, or who knows, if you're playing some really weird, crazy, all-in artifact sacrifice deck, you might want both. Once you get back to Historic, I don't think this sees play. It's just beaten out by Chromatic Star. So that is it. That is my impressions after looking through all the cards that are coming in Shadows over Innistrad Remastered for Arena. Please let me know what you think. This is a very fun set. I think it's going to open up a lot of new things that we can do. Some tribal decks are going to appear. It's going to... I think we will see this shake up the meta a little bit, at least in Historic Artisan. For those of you who are just fans of budget decks, this is a good set for you. Madness is now a thing. You can have fun with your Madness decks, and a couple of tribal decks are going to be good now. And with that, I think I'm going to close up the video. Please let me know down in the comments what you think, and have fun once Shadows over Innistrad Remastered comes out.